The long struggle. For centuries, the Vayari people devoted everything they had to a single dream, the construction of a starship so vast and so intricate that it consumed their entire civilization's resources and defined their culture across generations. Entire cities were dismantled for raw material, knowledge of agriculture and medicine was redirected toward ship engineering, and whole lifetimes passed with citizens working on only one portion of the endless structure. To the Vayari, this vessel was not just a machine but a symbol of their survival, their proof that they could endure beyond the death of their dying world. The planet that had given them birth was collapsing under environmental decay, its oceans poisoned, its atmosphere thinning, and its once rich soil turned into barren dust. Every year survival grew harder, and every year the hope of their people became tied to that single ship that was slowly rising from the surface like a mountain. Of steel generations were born and died, never knowing a world outside the shadow of the vessel. Children grew up believing that their only purpose was to continue the labor of their ancestors. Songs were sung about the shining hull plates, epic poems recorded the names of those who carried the first beams to the skeleton of the ship, and the Council of Elders preached that once the ship was completed, the Vayari would at last be free of despair. There was pride in their work but also chains because the destiny of every Vayari was already chosen at birth. Engineers trained their children in the same craft, welders handed down tools like sacred relics, and scholars argued over minute details of navigation systems that might not activate for another 100 years. Still the ship grew. Massive engines the size of mountains were lowered into place, life support systems designed to last for millennia were tested and sealed, and chambers large enough to house entire populations were carved out within the hull. The council told the people that this vessel would carry their species to a new home among the stars, a place where they would no longer fear famine or storms or the collapse of their world. And so the people sacrificed without question, because survival was more important than comfort. Entire bloodlines dedicated themselves to single components, some working lifetimes on one part that would later be hidden deep inside the vast interior of the vessel. They never saw the whole, only their part, yet they believed in the dream of unity. The day finally came when the last panel was locked into place. The council announced that centuries of labor had at last reached its purpose. The ship stood taller than any mountain, longer than any city, and wider than any plain. Its gleaming hull stretched across the horizon, a silver monument to patience and faith. Billions gathered to witness its awakening, and for the first time in history, the people felt the weight of their sacrifice lift. They looked at the ship and believed it was worth everything, worth the lost years, the hunger, the suffering, and the lost generations. When the engines roared to life, their planet trembled and the stars themselves seemed to lean closer. The Vayari did not yet know that in another corner of the galaxy, a young species called humanity had learned to do in a week what they had done in centuries. To them, the ship was perfection and salvation. To humanity, it would soon be only the beginning. The reveal of humanity. The launch of the great Vayari ship was meant to be the turning point of their history, and as its engines thundered into the void, the people celebrated like never before. The council stood proud, declaring to the galaxy that their people had survived their dying world and had risen to the stars through patience, determination, and sacrifice. For a moment they felt like the galaxy would look upon them with awe and respect because none had endured as they had. None had poured centuries into a single vessel so majestic and vast. They believed this was the moment the name of the Vayari would echo forever among the stars. The ship moved into the void, shining like a second sun, and its communications arrays sent greetings into space. Their leaders expected reverence, but what came back was confusion and whispers of something they did not yet understand. As their ship traveled deeper into settled space, they encountered the humans, a species younger than most others, a species once dismissed as reckless and inexperienced. The first Vayari explorers were stunned when they saw human fleets not of one or two vessels, but of hundreds of ships moving in formation, sleek, powerful, and bristling with weapons and technology that looked almost alive. These were not vessels that took centuries to build. They were built in days or weeks, rolling off massive orbital factories in endless numbers. The pride of the Vayari, their mountain of steel, suddenly felt like a relic when compared to the swarms of human starships that could blanket a system in a matter of days. The council tried to dismiss it at first, telling their people that humans built fragile machines without care for quality or longevity. Yet when the Vayari ship scanned the human fleets, they saw redundancy in every system, adaptive armor that shifted under fire, engines that burned brighter and faster than anything they had imagined. Most shocking of all was the sheer number of ships. For every one Vayari vessel, humanity could field hundreds and still build more. The Vayari, who had believed they were at the forefront of endurance, began to feel a tremor of doubt. They asked the humans how such feats were possible, and the answer was simple industry knowledge shared across billions of minds, a willingness to adapt and a refusal to bind generations to one dream, when many dreams could be realized at once. News of this revelation spread across the Vayari population. Citizens who had given their lives to one task felt awe and betrayal mixed together. Some wept with pride for their ship, while others whispered that perhaps their leaders had trapped them in a cage of tradition. Younger Vayari, who had grown restless under the endless burden, looked at the humans with envy. These humans had not wasted centuries on one monument. They had surged forward in countless directions, building, exploring, innovating. For the first time in living memory, the Vayari felt small, not because of their dying world, but because of what they saw in humanity. The council held emergency meetings to decide their stance. Some called for alliance with humanity to learn their ways. Others warned that humans were too dangerous, too fast, and would one day swallow the galaxy whole if not stopped. What unsettled them most was how casual the humans seemed about it all. For the Vayari, this ship was their everything, their blood and their history. For the humans, it was Tuesday. The contrast was unbearable. The Vayari ship drifted alongside a fleet of human frigates and dreadnoughts, and though it was larger and grander in appearance, it suddenly felt like a single stone standing before an avalanche. Thus began the shadow of fear and jealousy, because in the reflection of human power, the Vayari could no longer see their future clearly. They had spent centuries forging one shining dream, and in the blink of an eye that dream was dwarfed by a human reality that no one had ever thought possible. The clash of philosophies. The first meeting between the Vayari council and the human delegation was set aboard a neutral orbital station, chosen to avoid any display of power. But the truth was, power itself entered the chamber with humanity. The Vayari elders wore ceremonial robes, heavy with history and symbols, carved over generations, showing the lineage of those who had worked on their great ship. They spoke with slow, careful tones, as if every word was meant to last for centuries. The humans arrived in simple uniforms, crisp, clean, functional, and they wasted no time in pleasantries. They smiled, they laughed, they shook hands firmly, and then they spoke directly about cooperation, trade, and technology. To the Vayari, this was almost an insult, for how could beings treat such matters with so little gravity? And yet the humans carried a confidence that filled the room and silenced doubt. The elders began by presenting the legacy of their people. The ship that had taken so long to build, the sacrifices endured, the lives given generation after generation for this dream. They spoke of patience, discipline, unity, and reverence for tradition. The human leader listened politely, and then replied with something that unsettled every Vayari heart. He said that the past is a guide but never a chain, and that progress belongs to those who can change quickly and decisively. He told them that while the Vayari had poured centuries into one vessel, humanity had learned that survival is not about building the perfect ship, but about building enough ships and being willing to rebuild them faster than they can be destroyed. The words spread like fire through the station, every translator echoing them in tones that cut deeper than weapons. The clash of philosophies became clear in that moment. To the Vayari, the idea of imperfection was unthinkable. To spend resources on a vessel that would not last for millennia was wasteful and dishonorable. To humanity, there was no shame in impermanence, because every new design, every new ship was better than the last. Failure was not disgrace, it was data to be improved upon. The Vayari built for eternity, the humans built for tomorrow and for the day after tomorrow and again after that. One side sought to preserve a single monument, the other to flood the galaxy with endless creation. Jealousy began to poison the pride of the Vayari. Some whispered that humans had cheated using shortcuts without honor, while others secretly admired the results and dreamed of what their people could have been if they had embraced such methods long ago. The population back home began to fracture. Young Vayari questioned why they were forced to live under centuries of sacrifice when humanity showed another path. Even the engineers who had given everything to the great ship stared at human schematics and felt a pain deeper than any wound, because they realized their masterpiece might already be obsolete before its first voyage was complete. In the council chamber, the debate raged. The elders warned humanity that recklessness leads to ruin, that building too quickly leads to collapse. The human leader only smiled and answered that collapse is inevitable for those who cannot change. That simple sentence echoed in the minds of every Vayari present, and when they returned to their ship, they carried not only the memory of the words, but also the heavy realization that their grand monument might soon be remembered not as salvation, but as a warning of what happens when pride replaces progress. For the first time in their long history, the Vayari were forced to look inward and ask if patience had truly been their strength or if it had been their chain all along. Rising conflict. The tension that had begun in the council chamber did not fade once the Vayari returned to their ship. Instead, it spread like a sickness across their entire civilization. The elders had hoped to maintain unity, but the truth was that unity had been cracked the moment the people saw what humanity could achieve in a fraction of the time. Citizens whispered in the markets that perhaps their leaders had lied to them, or at least blinded them to possibilities beyond tradition. Workers who had spent lifetimes on hidden components of the vessel now looked at human schematics and saw how a single automated factory could replace their labor in weeks. Pride turned into bitterness, and envy grew heavier with every comparison. Within the council halls, voices clashed louder than ever before. Some elders argued that humanity should be treated as allies and guides, that their methods could rescue the Vayari from stagnation, that learning from them would ensure survival for countless generations to come. Others roared in defiance, declaring that the humans were a threat to everything the Vayari had sacrificed for, and that to admit their superiority was to dishonor every ancestor who had died for the dream of the great ship. The arguments grew so fierce that the once unified council nearly split apart. Each meeting ended with more accusations, more distrust, and more fear that the galaxy would no longer see the Vayari as a people of strength, but as relics of a forgotten age. The conflict deepened when fragments of the population began to act on their own. Groups of young engineers reached out to humans in secret, trading ideas and data, desperate to understand the secrets of rapid production. Elders labeled them traitors. Yet they became heroes among the youth who believed the only way forward was through change. At the same time, extremists emerged who swore that humanity's progress was dangerous and must be stopped before it spread. These extremists gathered in shadows, plotting sabotage against human factories and fleets. For the first time in centuries, the greatest threat to the Vayari was no longer their dying world but themselves. Humanity watched all of this with wary eyes. The humans did not laugh or mock the Vayari for their struggles, but they prepared themselves because they had seen such divisions before. They understood that jealousy often turned into violence, and that when a proud people felt humiliated, they could become dangerous. Human admirals began to move fleets quietly into position, not as an act of aggression, but as a shield in case desperation turned into open war. The great Vayari ship drifted through the void like a monument, but even its shadow could not hide the turmoil within. The breaking point arrived when a pirate armada struck a neutral system on the border. Both Vayari and human vessels were present, and both were drawn into the battle. For the Vayari, this was the first true test of their masterpiece, and for a moment, they believed it would prove their worth. The ship's cannons thundered, its armor held strong, and the crew shouted with pride as they struck down enemy after enemy. But as the fight continued, the truth became undeniable. Where the Vayari ship could fire once the human fleets fired 100 times. Where the Vayari ship could protect one colony, the humans could shield them all. Speed and numbers overwhelmed the pirates, and by the end it was humanity who secured victory, while the Vayari vessel, though still standing, seemed like an ancient statue in a storm. The battle did not end the conflict, it only sharpened it. Those who admired humanity saw proof that the future belonged to them and called for alliance at once. Those who despised them claimed that the humans had stolen the Vayari's moment of triumph, and that their dominance would soon crush every species in the galaxy. Whispers of rebellion and war spread faster than reason. The great ship, once a symbol of hope, had become a symbol of division. And as the stars turned above them, the Vayari faced a truth they could no longer escape. The age of patience was dying, and the age of speed had already arrived. The breaking point, the battle against the pirates, was supposed to settle the argument, but instead, it poured fire into the cracks of the Vayari people. Some saw the humans save, colonies with fleets that moved like storms across the stars, and they felt admiration and a desperate need to learn. Others saw only humiliation and betrayal, believing that their centuries of sacrifice had been mocked in a single day. The great ship had fought bravely, but it had not been enough, and the people knew it. Whispers turned into shouts, and shouts turned into riots in the cities that still clung to their dying world. Crowds accused the council of chaining them to the past, while others demanded war against humanity before they lost everything. The once united people had split into factions that could no longer speak with one voice. The council struggled to maintain control. Elders argued endlessly, their voices echoing in chambers filled with anger and fear. Some demanded an alliance with humanity to gain their knowledge. Others cried that to bend to humans was to erase the sacrifice of ancestors. Every debate ended in stalemate, and every stalemate weakened the authority of the council. The great ship, once a monument of pride, became a floating reminder of failure. Crews inside whispered that their labor meant nothing if the galaxy now measured strength by speed and adaptability, rather than patience and endurance. In the eyes of many, the great ship was already obsolete. A relic born in the wrong age. Humanity watched but did not gloat. The admirals knew too well that desperation often bred violence. Quietly, fleets were placed in defensive formations near Vayari space, not to attack but to prevent any sudden strike born of pride. Yet the humans also extended offers of partnership. They sent envoys carrying blueprints, industrial plans, and words of cooperation, but each offer was met with suspicion by half of the Vayari and with eager hope by the other half. Division deepened with every attempt at peace. The breaking point came when an external threat arrived greater than pirates or rebellion. A swarm of automated machines from beyond the rim surged into nearby sectors, stripping planets of resources and devouring everything in their path. The Vayari Council knew at once their single ship could not hold against such endless waves. It was designed to endure a journey, not a war against thousands of predators that never tired. Panic spread quickly, yet some elders still clung to their pride, insisting that their ship would prove itself in this crucible. The crew obeyed, but deep down they knew the truth. They had built a fortress, but humanity had built an army, and fortresses could be surrounded and consumed. When the swarm reached them, the difference was made clear. The great Vayari ship unleashed its full power, cannons blazing, shields holding for as long as they could. For every enemy it destroyed, 10 more appeared. And soon the crew was drowning in alarms and failures. Just when despair began to break them, human fleets arrived in force. Hundreds of ships surged like a tide around the Vayari vessel, striking the swarm from every angle. They did not fight with patience, they fought with speed, coordination, and relentless numbers. The swarm that had seemed endless began to crumble under the storm of human firepower. In that moment, the Vayari saw what their centuries of sacrifice had built compared to what humanity's adaptability had created. One ship standing alone against a tide, and hundreds of ships moving together like a living force that could bend the course of the galaxy. The breaking point was no longer about pride or envy, but about survival. The Vayari understood that without humanity they would be destroyed, and with humanity they might yet endure. The choice was no longer a matter of honor, it was a matter of life. The emotional shift when the swarm was finally destroyed, the battlefield was littered with drifting metal husks and silent wreckage. But in the center of it, all the great Vayari ship still floated scarred and battered. Its hull cracked in places where it had taken the brunt of attacks it could not repel alone. Around it, the human fleets reformed into neat patterns, their losses already being compensated by factories far away that could build replacements within days. For humanity, the battle was another chapter in a long story of survival. But for the Vayari, it was a wound carved into the soul of their people. They had seen with their own eyes that centuries of sacrifice could not stand against a storm of enemies, and that their future was no longer in their own hands unless they changed. Across the Vayari worlds, emotions exploded. Some citizens wept as they saw humanity extend rescue ships to pull Vayari survivors from burning wrecks, offering food and medicine without demanding anything in return. For those who had doubted humanity's intentions, this gesture spoke louder than any debate. They realized that humans did not gloat over their weakness. They did not mock their pride. They simply fought and saved lives because that was their nature. Others, however, fell deeper into anger, refusing to accept that their grand vessel had been humbled, insisting that humanity only offered help to hide their true goal of domination. Prideful voices demanded resistance, but for the first time those voices were met with equal resistance from their own people, who shouted back that survival mattered more than wounded honor. Inside the council, the split became undeniable. Younger leaders stood up against the elders, declaring that to cling to the past was to ensure extinction. They spoke with passion, pointing to the humans as proof that adaptability and cooperation were the true paths forward. Elders accused them of treachery, but the younger voices were no longer silent. The people themselves began to side with them, and whispers spread that the council might soon fracture permanently. The once unshakable hierarchy of the Vayari was breaking under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, humanity offered more than words. They opened their shipyards to Vayari engineers, allowing them to witness entire fleets being constructed before their eyes. The Vayari who walked those factories felt their hearts split in two, half filled with awe and half with regret. They realized that their people could have done this long ago if they had dared to let go of tradition. Some broke down in tears. Others felt fury at the wasted generations, but all of them understood that the galaxy had moved forward, while the Vayari had stood still. When human workers showed them designs that could be improved within weeks, it shattered the belief that perfection required centuries. The emotional shift spread faster than any political decree. Families who had once sworn to protect the legacy of the great ship now began teaching their children that change was not betrayal, but survival. Songs that once praised patience were rewritten to praise adaptability. The great ship itself was still honored, but in a different way, no longer seen as salvation but as a monument to lessons learned through sacrifice. The pride that had once blinded the Vayari began to give way to humility, and in that humility grew something new, a willingness to walk alongside humanity rather than against them. But beneath this shift there remained a dangerous tension. Not everyone was ready to abandon centuries of identity. Some extremists still swore they would never bow to humans and plotted in shadows to reclaim their pride through violence. The emotional shift had begun, but it was fragile and threatened at every moment by those who could not let go of the past. Humanity knew this and watched carefully, offering open hands but preparing shields all the same. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath as the Vayari stood on the edge of transformation. Would they embrace the path of survival through partnership or fall back into the ruins of their pride? The future waited, and the choice would shape not only their people but the balance of the galaxy itself. The legacy of unity. The choice that hung over the Vayari people became unavoidable when the council itself collapsed under the weight of division. Elders who clung to the old ways could no longer command the respect of a population that had seen the truth with their own eyes. The younger voices, those who had argued for change, rose from within the fractured halls and carried with them the will of the people who no longer wanted to be chained to the past. What once would have been unthinkable happened as entire worlds voted to dissolve the ancient order and to step into a new alliance with humanity. At first, the transition was turbulent. Protests and clashes broke out. Extremists tried to sabotage factories and fleets, but they could not halt the tide. The people had already shifted, and once that shift began, there was no turning back. The great ship that had once been the soul of the Vayari now drifted through space not as a weapon nor as a vessel of migration, but as a monument. It became a living museum where the people could walk the endless corridors and remember the sacrifices of their ancestors. Guides told the story of how their people had once believed patience was strength, and how they had learned that patience without adaptability becomes weakness. School children toured the massive halls and were taught that their future did not lie in repeating the past, but in embracing change. Far from being abandoned, the great ship took on a new role, not as salvation, but as memory, and its shadow reminded all who saw it that unity could not be built on pride alone. Humanity welcomed the Ve'ari into their fold not as servants or dependents, but as partners. Factories once reserved for human ships now produced vessels with blended designs, merging Ve'ari precision with human speed. The first joint fleet was launched within a year, and when it sailed into the stars, it carried both banners side by side. The galaxy that had once watched the Ve'ari with pity and humanity with suspicion now looked upon this alliance with awe. Rivals who had once hoped to exploit the Ve'ari weakness found themselves facing fleets stronger than ever before. The lesson was clear to all. A people who learn from their failures become more dangerous than those who never failed at all. For the Ve'ari themselves, the change was deeper than technology. They discovered freedom in choice, something generations had been denied. Children no longer grew up bound to a single craft dictated by lineage. They could dream of building new ships, exploring, trading, even creating art or science beyond the endless labor of construction. For the first time in memory, the Ve'ari felt alive not because of one dream, but because of countless dreams now possible. The weight of centuries lifted, and with it came a pride no longer poisoned by envy. Pride in survival, pride in growth, pride in standing side by side with a people who had shown them a new way. Humanity, too, was changed by the alliance. They saw in the Ve'ari a mirror of what could happen if their own speed ever turned into arrogance. They learned caution and respect for history from those who had sacrificed so much. Where the Ve'ari gained adaptability, the humans gained perspective, and together they became stronger than either could have been alone. Joint academies were built where students of both species trained together. Joint crews filled the bridges of new starships, and bonds of friendship began to replace the bitterness of the past. Years later, when the story of the Ve'ari was told, across the stars, it was no longer a tale of a people who wasted centuries on one ship. It was the tale of a people who endured long enough to learn the most important lesson of all, that survival is not about perfection or pride, but about unity and change. The great ship still shone among the stars, and though it never carried a population to a new home, it carried a greater legacy. The reminder that even the proudest can learn and that even the slowest can catch up when guided by hope. The galaxy did not forget the centuries of sacrifice, but it remembered even more the courage it took to let go of pride and embrace a new future. The Ve'ari and humanity together stepped into that future, not as rivals but as allies. And the stars, that once seemed so far now waited like an open horizon. The galaxy had changed forever, and in the records of both peoples one truth was written with finality. The age of patience had ended, the age of adaptability had begun, and in that age the alliance of Ve'ari and humans would shape the destiny of countless worlds, the dawn of a new age. The great ship drifted silent in the void, no longer a weapon, no longer a lifeboat, but a monument to everything the Ve'ari had once believed, and everything they had endured across centuries. It stood as a reminder of sacrifice, but also as a reminder of limitation, because though it had carried the pride of a people, it had also chained them to the past. Now it was more than steel and engines. It was a story etched across the stars telling all who gazed upon it that strength is not found in one unyielding dream, but in the courage to change when the universe demands it. The Ve'ari had walked a long path of patience, discipline, and pride, and in the end they discovered that none of these alone could save them. What saved them was the moment they chose to set aside pride and extend their hand to humanity. In that act they found survival, and in survival they found rebirth. The humans who had once seemed reckless became their teachers and their partners. Together they forged fleets that carried not one dream, but thousands, each ship a new possibility, each launch a new future. Where the Ve'ari once believed only a single vessel could bear their destiny, they now saw that destiny was not bound to steel or tradition, but to the unity of will between species generations. Later, the Ve'ari children no longer spoke of centuries lost. They spoke of centuries gained. They told stories of how their ancestors had once tied themselves to a single ship, and how humanity had shown them another way. They walked the corridors of the great vessel, not in sorrow, but in reverence, for it had not saved them through its engines, but through its lesson. It became the heart of their culture not because it carried them to a new world, but because it carried them to a new understanding. Even humanity honored it, for it had become the bridge that linked two civilizations into one. In the end, the galaxy did not remember the Vayari as the people who wasted centuries. It remembered them as the people who endured long enough to learn and who were wise enough to change. And humanity was remembered not only as builders of fleets, but as the ones who reached out and lifted another species into a brighter dawn. The Alliance stood as proof that survival is not won by speed alone or by patience alone, but by unity between hearts willing to grow together. The stars that had once felt distant now stretched open before them as paths yet to be walked side by side. And so the great ship still moves in orbit eternal, not as a weapon or a relic, but as a beacon to all who gaze upon it, whispering a truth that will echo through the ages, that even the strongest monument fades, but the spirit of unity endures forever. The end.